The Viking stories we know today are strong and proud stories. They speak about brave warriors. They speak about long ships cutting through cold seas. They speak about victory, honor, and fame. These stories were written to be remembered. They were written to make people proud of their past. But every story that chooses what to remember also chooses what to forget. And the Viking sagas forgot something very important. They forgot the girls. This story is about those girls, not the warriors, not the kings, not the battles, but the young girls who survived Viking raids and then disappeared inside Viking society. Their fate was not written clearly. It was hidden between lines, hidden behind silence. And that silence tells us more than words ever could. The Viking Age was a time of movement. People did not stay in one place. They traveled, traded, fought, and settled new lands. Raids were part of this life. Viking ships would arrive suddenly. Villages near the sea had little warning. By the time people understood what was happening, it was already too late. Houses were broken, fields were destroyed, fear filled the air. The sagas describe these raids quickly. They focus on bravery and strength. They rarely slow down to describe the people who were taken, but many were taken. When a Viking raid ended, the goal was not only to take gold, it was also to take people. Men who fought back were often killed. Older people were left behind, but many young women and girls were kept alive. This was not kindness. This was planning. In Viking society, a captured girl had value. She could work. She could be sold. She could increase the power of a household. So survival did not mean safety. It meant ownership. Most of these girls came from lands far away from Scandinavia. From England, from Ireland, from Scotland, from small villages along the coast. Before the raid, they lived simple lives. They helped their families. They shared meals. They spoke a language they had known since birth. They had names that mattered to someone. Then, in a single day, everything was taken. There was no time to prepare, no time to understand. One moment they were at home. The next moment home no longer existed. The sagas do not describe the moment of capture in detail. They do not explain the fear. They do not explain the confusion. But we can imagine it. Hands pulling. Voices shouting in a language they did not know. Smoke in the air. The sound of the sea nearby. And then movement. Always movement. The girls were taken to the ships. Viking longships were narrow and crowded. They were built for speed, not comfort. The girls were placed among strangers, people who spoke differently, people who laughed and talked as if nothing important had happened. The journey across the sea could take days, sometimes weeks. The girls did not know where they were going. They did not know if they would live. They did not know if they would ever see land again. Fear became quiet. When fear lasts too long, it changes into something else. It becomes silence. Language was the first thing they lost. Their words had no power on the ship. No one answered them. No one cared. So they spoke less and less, until even their thoughts felt smaller. This is how control begins, not with chains, but with confusion, with not being understood. Some girls did not even reach Scandinavia. During the journey, Viking traders met others like them, people who wanted to buy and sell. Human lives were part of trade. A girl could be exchanged for silver, for tools, for animals. The sagas speak proudly about trade and wealth. They list items taken from faraway lands. They do not describe what it feels like to be traded like an object, to stand still while strangers decide your worth. Girls who were not sold during the journey were taken into Viking homes. This is where many modern stories become confused. Some people today like to believe that these girls became wives, that they were accepted. But Viking society was strict. There was a clear difference between a free woman and a slave. A free woman had rights. She belonged to a family. Her voice mattered. A slave girl had none of this. She belonged to someone else. The Norse word for a slave was thrall. A thrall was owned. Slave girls worked every day. They cooked, they cleaned, they carried water, they cared for animals. Their work began early. It ended late. They did not choose this life. They could not leave it. The sagas rarely describe this work because it was normal, and normal suffering is often ignored. The girls were expected to change everything about themselves. They learned new words, new rules, new ways to behave. Their old customs were not respected. Their old gods were forgotten. Many were given new names, or no names at all. When a name is taken away, a person slowly disappears. The hardest part was not pain, it was time. Day after day, year after year, life continued around them. They watched children grow. They watched seasons change. They watched people make choices they could never make. And slowly, resistance faded. Not because they agreed, but because silence was safer. The sagas were not written during these moments. They were written later, by people who wanted to protect honor. Stories were shaped carefully. Heroic men were remembered. Victories were celebrated. The lives of slave girls did not fit this picture, so they were left out. By the time the sagas were written, many of these girls were already gone. They had grown old in foreign lands. They had lived and worked and faded quietly. Their pain had become ordinary, and ordinary pain is easy to forget, with girls still alive, still working, still silent. Their fate was not finished yet. It was only beginning. Life inside a Viking household did not begin with violence. It began with routine. For the slave girls, each day looked almost the same. They woke early. They worked until night. There were no questions asked, no choices given. Their lives were not guided by feelings. They were guided by orders. This kind of control did not need anger. It needed obedience. And obedience was learned slowly. Inside the home, the girls were always watched. Not closely, not harshly, but enough to remind them that freedom was not theirs. They cooked meals they did not eat first. They cleaned homes that were not theirs. They cared for children who were not their own. Their hands were always busy. Busy hands do not ask questions. The sagas rarely describe these girls directly. When they appear, it is only for a moment. A single line. A short mention, never a name, never a voice. The stories focus on men, on honor, on family pride. Slave girls did not belong to honor stories. They belonged to silence. In Viking society, there was a clear line. Free people had families and protection. Slaves did not. A slave girl could be moved at any time, sold, given away, punished. She had no legal voice. If she was hurt, there was no justice for her. If she cried, no one wrote it down. This was normal. And because it was normal, it was invisible. One of the hardest truths is about motherhood. Some slave girls were forced to have children. The sagas mention children born to slave women. But the mothers are barely noticed. The child belonged to the household, not to the woman who gave birth. Sometimes the child became free later in life. Sometimes the child remained a slave. The mother had no say. She carried life without control over its future. Imagine raising a child who may never know your real name, your real language, your real home. Imagine watching that child grow while knowing they may be taken away. This pain did not scream. It stayed quiet. Quiet pain lasts longer. Over time, many slave girls stopped resisting. Not because they agreed, but because resistance brought suffering. Silence brought survival. They learned when to look down, when to speak, when not to speak. They learned how to disappear while still standing in the room. This was a skill learned through fear. Some people believe that time made things easier, that years softened the pain. But time did not bring freedom. It brought forgetting. Old memories became weaker. Faces from home became unclear. Language faded. When you cannot remember your past clearly, you begin to accept your present. This is how identity is erased without force. The sagas did not record this process. They did not need to, because it worked. Slave girls became part of daily life, part of background movement, like furniture, like tools, always present, never important. The Viking sagas were written much later. By people who wanted to remember strength, they chose stories carefully. They wrote about brave journeys, about gods and heroes. They avoided stories that felt shameful. The suffering of slave girls did not bring pride. So it was left out. This silence was not accidental. It protected families. It protected bloodlines. It protected honor. To speak about slave girls was to admit how much Viking success depended on them. So the sagas stayed quiet. By the time these stories were written, many slave girls had already lived full lives, not full of choice, not full of joy, but full of work. They grew old in places they never chose. They died far from home. Their graves, if they had any, were not marked with names. This is the cruel truth. Many of these girls survived everything. They survived raids. They survived travel. They survived years of control. But they did not survive memory. They became invisible while still alive. And this was not rare. It was common. So common that it felt normal. And normal suffering is the easiest kind to forget. As years passed, many of the slave girls grew older. Time did not stop for them. It only moved quietly. Their hair changed color. Their hands became rough from work. Their backs carried the weight of many days. They were no longer young girls taken in raids. They were women shaped by silence. And still their names were not written. Most of them never returned home. Not because they chose not to, but because home no longer existed in the same way. Families had moved. Villages had changed. Years had passed. Even if freedom had come, there was nowhere left to go. This is how captivity becomes permanent. Not through walls, but through time. Some slave girls lived long enough to see their children grow old. Children who spoke a different language. Children who followed different gods. Children who did not know their mother's real story. These children became part of Viking society. They married. They had families of their own. Life continued, but the woman who gave them life remained in the background. This was one of the most painful endings. To survive long enough to be forgotten by even your own blood, not because they did not care, but because they never knew. Silence had done its work. When the Viking Age slowly came to an end, the world began to change. Christian writers began to write history. Old stories were written down as sagas. These writers chose what mattered. They chose kings. They chose battles. They chose heroes. They did not choose slave girls. The sagas were not written to tell the full truth. They were written to protect memory, memory of strength, memory of honor. Painful details were not useful, so they were removed, not erased with fire, but erased with silence. This is why we rarely hear about these girls today, not because they were few, but because they were many, too many. Their suffering was normal, and normal suffering is easy to ignore. What makes their fate disturbing is not only what happened to them, it is how calmly it happened. There were no dramatic endings, no great escapes, just long lives lived without choice. They were not remembered as victims. They were not remembered as heroes. They were not remembered at all. They were absorbed into households, into families, into history itself, until nothing remained but quiet traces. Sometimes we find small signs, a grave without a name, a story that suddenly goes silent, a line in a saga that moves on too quickly. These are the places where their lives once existed. History often tells us about death, but it struggles to tell us about survival, especially survival without freedom. These girls survived everything except being remembered. This story is not meant to make us hate the past. It is meant to make us understand it. The Vikings were not monsters. They were people, and people build systems. Some systems create heroes. Others erase lives quietly. The sagas survived because they spoke of pride. They survived because they avoided shame. The slave girls did not survive memory because remembering them was uncomfortable. When we listen closely to old stories, we must also listen to what is missing. Silence is not empty. It is full of meaning. And in Viking sagas, that silence belongs to the girls who were taken alive and never written back in. They did not vanish in fire. They did not vanish in battle. They vanished in routine, in work, in quiet days. They lived, they aged, they died, and history turned the page. So when we hear stories of Viking glory, we should also remember this. Behind every victory were lives that paid the price, lives that were never named, never honored, lives that survived only to disappear. That is the disturbing fate hidden inside Viking saga stories. Not cruelty alone, but silence. And silence, when it lasts long enough, becomes erasure.